Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this week's edition of our weekly morning briefings on geopolitical challenges. We are live every Thursday at 8:30 a.m. here on Zoom and available on YouTube afterwards. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I am head of the Joint Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing this morning's briefing. Today, we will be looking once again at Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine, and the disastrous consequences for the country and its people. Russia continues to attack Ukrainian targets. Just this week, missile attacks on Kiev and Kharkiv killed more than a dozen civilians and injured more than 70. Yesterday, we heard about a large Russian military transport plane supposedly carrying 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war that crashed in the Belgorod region. The information situation is still somewhat unclear, and perhaps András can touch on this particular incident. More generally, though, we have to address the big geopolitical questions about crumbling Western support, the military prospects for Ukraine as we're approaching the third year of Russia's full-scale assault, and about the decisive factors in the coming weeks and months. To discuss these questions, I'm glad to introduce two excellent speakers. First up will be our Senior Research Fellow, Dr. András Rácz, who is at the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia here at DGAP. He focuses on Russia's foreign and security and defense policy, and he previously worked, amongst other places, at the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and the former Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. Welcome, András. Next up will be Orysia Lutsevych, who is Deputy Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program and head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. Orysia, you focus on, amongst other things, social change, civil society, and democratic resilience. You've previously been executive director at the Open Ukraine Foundation. And as I hear, you've just been to Davos and have some fresh insights from a Ukrainian perspective. So we're very glad to have you on the morning briefing. Welcome. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind you that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We will kick off this morning's conversation on the panel with short introductory statements and then open up for questions after about 20-25 minutes or so. If you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A, please raise your virtual hand or your real hand and ask a question. You can also post things in the chat, although we much rather have a live conversation here on the panel. And finally, a word of thanks to my colleagues in the events and communication teams, and above you, all to you, our listeners in the audience, for your interest and for asking crisp and intelligent questions later on. So without much further ado, let me hand over things to András.
Thank you. Good morning, dear colleagues. Can you hear me? Perfect. Thank you. Thank you again for joining us today morning at DGAP morning briefing. As usual, almost for about 2 years, let me start with a brief overview of the military situation in the front lines. As usual, we will start with showing some maps from the Institute for the Study of War, just to provide an overview of the overall military situation. And after showing these maps, I will go down to a number of concrete details. So now I'm trying to share my screen. Now you are supposed to see the screen. You do, right?
Yes.
Good, perfect. So, as you see, not much has changed. In the strategic scale, heavy fighting has been going on several sections of the front line. Most intensive fighting has been going on in the Luhansk front line at the Kupiansk-Svatove direction. Here, Russian forces have been slowly but steadily advancing. The situation is the same further south at the Bakhmut region and also at Avdiivka. As you see, this kind of darkish yellowish color indicates the territories recently gained by Russian forces. The bad news, dear colleagues, is that even though many in the Western media describe the situation as a stalemate, in fact, it's not a stalemate. In fact, this is a situation where Russian troops have been advancing very slowly, but unfortunately, quite steadily. This means a few dozens of meters, a few hundred meters per day, but the Russian advance is unfortunately clear, despite all the strong defenses of Ukraine troops. Right now at the front line, the initiative has clearly been in the hands of the invaders, in the hands of the Russian forces. What's the reason of that? The most important reason is not the failure of Ukraine's summer counteroffensive. Several months have passed since then. The main reason right now is the critical shortage of ammunition on the Ukrainian side. Right now, based on open source information, Ukrainian artillery is able to shoot approximately 2,000 shells per day. Dear colleagues, on a front line that is 1,000 kilometers long. There are Ukrainian guns which are silent for a week. At the same time, Russian artillery is able to deliver 10 to 12,000 shells per day, sometimes even 50,000. So there is a dominant Russian artillery superiority due to the shortage of ammunition on the Ukrainian side. This is one of the very critical dimensions of the Western support provided to Ukraine. This Western support is at much lower level than it was a year ago, or even it was compared to half a year ago. The Kiel Institute of World Economics, who provide the Ukraine Support Tracker project, recently published the information that Western support provided to Ukraine in the third quarter of last year was 90% less than a year ago. So declining Western support has an actual effect on the tactical situation on the front line, very negatively affecting the ability of Ukraine's forces to defend themselves. Shortage of ammunition materializes not only in terms of artillery shells, but also in terms of air defense missiles. As you know it very well, since the 29th of December, Russia restarted major concentrated attacks against Ukraine's infrastructure. Unlike last year, this year, Russia, or like not last year, but the year 2022, still haven't got used to the new year. So unlike 2022, Russia doesn't seem to target specifically Ukraine's energy infrastructure this time. Instead, they've been focusing more on the military infrastructure and other elements of critical infrastructure. So the main target is not that much the Ukrainian population like last year, at least when it comes to the planned hits. But as Russia has been using a high number of notoriously inaccurate missiles, damage and casualties among the civilian population are mounting. Just 2 days ago, Russia launched 3 major waves of attacks against the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, using more than a dozen S-300 missiles, also Iskanders, also anti-ship missiles. The objective has clearly been to overburden Ukraine's air defense, particularly when it comes to such advanced air defense missiles, which would be able to take down incoming Russian ballistic missiles. And the attacks on Kharkiv demonstrate that Ukraine is running critically low, particularly when it comes to the ammunition, to the Patriot missile systems. Another bad news regarding missiles: since the very beginning of January, North Korean missiles have been detected among the Russian inventory. There have been cases where Russia already deployed North Korean-made ballistic missiles against Ukrainian targets. So North Korea is not delivering only ammunition anymore. North Korea has been supplying Russia with artillery ammunition already for half a year, and also some old artillery guns, but also fairly advanced ballistic missiles. And this is indeed a story to watch, because Vladimir Putin, Russian President Vladimir Putin, is preparing for paying a visit to Pyongyang, to North Korea, most likely to discuss further military assistance coming from the North Korea regime to Russia. So all these point a fairly bleak picture when it comes to the tactical and operational situation on the front line. Yet still, as my last point, I think it's important to emphasize, even if we zoom out a bit, or here, bigger picture on the Donetsk Oblast, even if Ukraine loses some territory, and Avdiivka may actually fall fairly soon. Even if Ukraine loses some territory, the Donbass is still huge, and the Donbass is heavily fortified. So even tactical scale losses do not change the strategic situation. You remember very well how Russia recently occupied Mariinka, small village here, somewhat west of Donetsk, and Russian media celebrated it as some kind of a strategic scale victory. Dear colleagues, this has been completely ruined small town of some 10,000 inhabitants before the war. So even if Russian troops may reach some tactical successes in the front line, the overall operational and particularly strategic picture is yet unlikely to change. Ukraine is still able to defend the overall stability of its front line. Yet still, if Western military assistance remains as low as it is, and bad news, this is not something one can boost in a short time. The result is that with Western military assistance still low, and the growth rate, stop sharing, and the growth rate is unfortunately slow, as far as it can be reconstructed from open sources, particularly the first half of this year will be very hard for Ukrainian defenders regarding particularly the shortage of artillery and air defense ammunition. This does not mean that Ukrainian front line would collapse. This does not mean that Ukraine would be in the need to give up fighting, but this indeed means that Ukraine is going to face some very hard months to come on the front lines. So that's it from me for the start. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, András, for painting this indeed bleak picture. And allow me to ask a brief follow-up question before we hand over to Orysia. Because as you talk about the levels of Western military support and the lack of ammunition, I was wondering if you could tell our audience a little bit more about the kind of military support now needed. Is it just more of the same? Is it just a question of levels of support? Or can you say a little bit more about the kind of military support, especially coming from which sources, looking at the United States and Europe, of course? That's one follow-up question. And second, tiny follow-up question, if you could just say a few words about the kind of information that we have about the plane crash at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I try both. When it comes to what type of military assistance is needed, first, of course, more of the same. So artillery ammunition ranging from howitzers to mortars, particularly HIMARS ammunition, all this. Artillery ammunition would be needed in massive quantities. At least some level of parity would need to be achieved vis-a-vis the Russian forces. However, in addition to more of the same, there are other things which are also needed. First, bigger number of advanced air defense missiles, which are able to take down Russian ballistic missiles. Because particularly if North Korea starts delivering ballistic missiles in bigger numbers, Ukraine is practically defenseless against those. So more advanced air defense missiles are needed as an extra. More electronic warfare equipment is also needed, particularly against the newer Russian drones. And the third thing needed would be to assist Ukraine in the production of its own weapons, including drones, naval drones, and other equipment. Ukraine is very innovative in designing new weapon systems. However, when it comes to production capabilities, there are shortages. When it comes to more of the same, one of the lessons of last year's counterattack, that the repair and maintenance of Western-made military vehicles, particularly heavy armored vehicles, constitutes a serious bottleneck. Dear colleagues, every damaged tank, every damaged Western-made armored fighting vehicle had to be taken out from Ukraine for any major repair. This needs to change. So repair bases need to be deployed closer to Ukraine, or if possible, into Ukraine herself, in order to speed up the repair and resupplies. And when it comes to the shut down Russian Ilyushin military cargo aircraft yesterday, there is a lot of information noise about the story. What can be confirmed that yes, an Ilyushin 76 heavy military cargo aircraft was shot down by Ukrainian air defense not that far away from Belgorod. What can also be confirmed is that Russia has been conducting a concentrated, very intensive information operation in order to shape the narrative about the loss of this aircraft. Russia has been circulating a list of alleged Ukrainian prisoners of war who were, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, killed on the board of that aircraft. However, several names are wrong on that list. Some of the soldiers mentioned on that list have already been exchanged before. So what can be stated also for fact that Russia is certainly trying to blur the lines. Russia is certainly not telling the truth about what exactly happened. it would be a decisive moment if Russia would agree to an international investigation of the crash site. However, this is unlikely to happen. Russian authorities already sealed off the crash site. Even civilian rescuers have been pushed out, and now the military has been conducting all the necessary work at the crash site. So unless some leaks take place, it would be much harder to verify what exactly happened than, let's say, in case of the MH17 airliner 10 years ago. So still, we need to wait. We need to wait for more information to emerge. Still, when it comes from the perspective of, strictly from the perspective of air defense, this has been another demonstration of Ukraine's capabilities, because anyways, Ukraine has been able to shut down large Russian military aircraft way inside Russia's core territories. So this is something that Russia needs to take into account, that Ukrainian air defense is able to endanger Russian aircraft also deep in either in Russian or in the occupied territories. Just remember the airborne radar system shut down like 2 weeks ago, and the Ilyushin 22 damaged together with it. But still, I'm not able to tell you the absolute truth of what happened with that Ilyushin yesterday. We need to wait.
Thank you, András. So this is very helpful. Now let's move from the strictly military side of things to a more political and big picture. Orysia, over to you.
Thank you, Jan. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining, and thanks, DGAP, for bringing this briefing together. I think the moment calls for a serious reflection and action, actually. I mean, we are, I think, in the critical juncture of this war, and this has been clearly communicated by President Zelensky in Davos. I was there, not in the Congress Hall, for the full disclosure. I'm not a member, only Bronwyn Maddox from Chatham House goes to the big stage. But there was a lot of conversations going around the Congress Hall and big Ukrainian pavilion that actually had 2 convening stages with more than, I think, 30 panels, ranging from the future of war to how do we seize Russian assets and about Russian war crimes. So the Ukrainian delegation, both official and civil society, media, business, they were actually raising alarm bells that so much is at stake. And it seems like the Western alliance, which is more than 50 nations, is not able to command resources. There were a lot of references to the combined GDP of the transatlantic community, but less than 1% of those resources actually dedicated or delivered, not even delivered, but earmarked, to be more precise, for Ukrainian efforts to actually defeat such a dangerous and large enemy. So Ukrainians spoke of 3 things, and President Zelensky framed again this whole Russian invasion of Ukraine as 13 years of a permanent and dangerous war that starts with Crimea, Syria, and now Ukraine. We see the spiral of violence that is stemming from very dangerous militaristic ideology of Putin and people who captured Russia that only wants more war. And the moment of the war where we are politically now for Putin's regime, something very important to understand, he is rewiring and reshaping his economy, his society for a bigger war, not for negotiations with Ukraine, negotiations with the West, not for de-escalations. And many of you may have seen circulations also on social media, this poster in the center of Moscow that says basically the borders of Russia have no limits, right? This is the kind of message the Russian people are getting from President Putin. This probably reminds you something very dangerous that was happening in European history in the 20th century. So we have to really take it seriously, because if this militant ideology is not defeated, let's not fool ourselves that if there is any kind of a ceasefire or a settlement in Ukraine, the war on the continent will be over. Ukrainians are very, I think, somber and clear-minded that they are buying time for Western alliance to wake up, to put its defense and military complex on a serious production line, and then then gives an opportunity to actually not manage it as a crisis, as we have been doing in the last 700 days, but actually commit to Ukraine's victory. And we are seeing it from some countries. I would say the UK clearly is one of those examples where there is a high-level political commitment to Ukrainian victory. And if you didn't have time to listen to Prime Minister Sunak's speech in the Ukrainian parliament, I think it sets very clear strategy and narrative for that. The security agreement that UK has signed with Ukraine for very long-term period includes military cooperation, includes protection in case of future aggression, and commits to that Ukrainian victory. This cannot be said about Germany, and and we are talking here with the German audience, and I would like to say that Germany, alongside the policy of President Biden, have actually created the current predicament. The situation that Ukraine is now has been created by Western strategy, especially Germany and United States, to allow Ukraine to withstand Russian aggression, to deny Putin, of course, the opportunity to roll over Ukraine, but not to give enough support, training, assistance for Ukraine to actually resolutely defeat Russian troops on Ukrainian territory. And I think if we continue this kind of strategy, Ukraine may collapse. The war is arithmetic, like András was saying. Right now, the proportion of artillery is 6 Russian shells to 1 Ukrainian. And Russians have a very clear plan. There was an interesting article by the head of foreign intelligence published at the end of the year that identifies 3 clear steps that Russians will be taking in this year. Take more territory, attack defense industry and infrastructure to basically make Ukraine uninhabitable for people, because, countries, this is not just territory. You need, people, you need economy on these territories to flourish and to cause internal destabilization. And I wouldn't be surprised that this information operation with the Ilyushin airplane and with the prisoners of war is one set of those information operations to undermine support for Zelensky and to create cleavages and infighting inside Ukraine between the families of the prisoners, between the senior command, between Zelensky. They're working restlessly, both in Ukraine, in our Western societies, to actually obstruct the right policy making. So what is needed? I think András specifically and well outlined what is needed on the military front. I would say long-range missiles, something he didn't mention. We do know the plea of Ukrainians for Taurus. Ukraine needs long-range missiles to attack Russian supply lines. Otherwise, this will be endless war. But also, we need to take action on Russian state assets. There's no reason why German or UK taxpayers should be solely responsible for financing Ukraine. There's a legal framework for this. We see move on the part of Washington, and we see actually, again, German kind of reluctance to move on and lead Europe on this front. We do need to tighten sanction regime to prevent Russia from rearming its industry, and Ukrainian monitoring of military parts shows that there are a lot of actually German, French, US, Canadian components in those missiles and drones. That actually means much tighter export control and secondary sanctions. And let's remember, the only way to put a serious pressure on Russian economy is an oil price. I'm not an economist, but this is, one of the important pillars if we really want to exert pressure on limiting Putin's capability to wage war. And
Orysia, can I interrupt you here? And I want to get into your conversation and invite our audience to ask some questions and make this as interactive as possible. And if you allow, I wanted to ask a brief follow-up question to you as well, because you mentioned the support from both the United States and Germany and how that's been helpful in shaping the war as a whole. But then again, of course, there's been a lot of criticism of both the German position in terms of support and also the worries about crumbling US support. So I'm wondering what Ukrainian politicians, the Ukrainian government is currently thinking in terms of its support strategy. Who is it addressing, and how is this going to change the big picture? And maybe another quick follow-up question, because I know that you work on domestic affairs as well. Maybe you could give us a bit of a clear picture of what this war against and in Ukraine on Ukrainian territory does since it's lasted the full-scale assault for almost 2 years now. I'm sure this has deep consequences for society, democratic resilience, etc. So the longer the war lasts, I suppose there are mounting challenges within Ukraine as well. So perhaps you could say a word on that. But I also see that we've got questions and hands shooting up in the audience and in the chat. So I will pick these up in a second. But first, back to you, Orysia.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the US and German support to Ukraine has been a mixed picture. I think there's been some amazing things done by Biden administration and Chancellor Scholz in backing Ukraine, and in Germany actually waking up to the war in Europe, and the powerhouse of economy and defense cannot just observe the situation. I understand all the difficulties with actually driving the strategy, but it's time. Otherwise, if we have Trump in office and if we have more isolationist America, Europe will be left to its own defenses. And if we cannot hide behind the backs of the White House anymore, White House may be, involved in other regional conflicts, as we see them already in the Middle East. We may see escalation in South China Sea. I think this year is a critical year. Either we in Europe seriously prepare and take our defenses seriously, or as we know it, Putin, if he cannot solve the problem of Ukraine, will be enlarging the conflict. We've seen recent, electronic warfare deployed out of Königsberg, Kaliningrad, that actually shows capacity of Russia to overpower electronic networks inside NATO territory. So what I am saying is that what Ukrainians are, of course, targeting Washington because they've always been the leader of this Rammstein coalition, and because American army and American defense industries is heating up much faster than Europeans in terms of production. Now, you asked me about domestic situation. Wars never end well, even for the winners. When you think about the impact of war on the Great Britain, and that was a winner in the coalition, it was horrendous. And of course, right now, Ukraine is able to maintain a certain level of normalcy in a society, and those who travel to Ukraine, you could see the shelves full of food, banking system is working, railway is working, schools are working, although children spend quite a lot of time, honestly, in the bomb shelter. But this will not continue if we do not provide timely, not only military, but microfinancial assistance. And if Ukraine spirals into hyperinflation, I don't have to explain this audience what that would mean, both for politics, for war, and for economy. But I see a strong determination of not only Zelensky, but also private sector and civil society to build self-reliance. Ukrainians are not ready to give up, capitulate, because the West is diminishing its assistance, which has been the case, as András described. Ukrainians say what we can do internally. So they are building up defense industry, which is not easy at times of war. They are actually pulling all the fiscal revenues from the local communities, let's say income tax from soldiers, to the national budget, so that it can be spent on defense production. And they are mobilizing more people. And within that mobilization, it's of course a very difficult political issue. The main kind of concern of Ukrainians is not that they are afraid to go and die for Ukraine. They are concerned about the quality of mid-level command in the Ukrainian armed forces, and they want to see reform also in how Ukrainian army conducts operation on the ground, to get reassurance that they will have both skills and technology and proper training. They are getting very little training from the moment they are drafted to the moment they are deployed on the battlefield. So all in all, Ukraine is not preparing neither to capitulate or to give in to Russian demands. It's preparing to fight back.
Thank you. Thank you for these insights. Now I'd like to pick up questions from Philipp Hirsemenzel and Klaus Wittmann. If you could please identify yourself and ask a quick question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. Thank you both for what seems to be a very bleak picture. So if I can just summarize that we're really, and we, the West, as it were, seem to be losing the war on all scales, slowly but steadily on the front line, as András has explained. Also losing the information war, as both of you explained, and simply not capable of producing enough and delivering enough ammunition. So if you could elaborate a little bit on the possible impact, additional impact of a Trump withdrawal. If we're not delivering right, about Trump victory, if we're not delivering right now, what kind of an impact would that have? And as Orysia just said, Ukrainians are not willing to give up. So this may just be an observation on my part, but it seems to me that the Ukrainians are moving more into Russian territory and doing more behind the front lines. Is that something that's increasing? Is that a shift in tactics of the Ukraine, or is that just my interpretation? Thank you very much.
Thank you. András, would you like to pick this one up? And perhaps also some of the questions in the chat, and we'll come to the other questions from Klaus Wittmann and Benjamin Tallas in a moment.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Philip. I'm trying to answer them in reverse order. When it comes to Ukrainian deep strikes against Russian core territory, yes, you're absolutely right. The trend is increasing. This is thanks to, or as a result of, Ukraine's growing domestic drone production. With a bit of exaggeration, right now in every Ukrainian garage, some guys are putting together drones. Ukraine has built up a massive drone production capability. I have the data from December last year. Nearly 50,000 drones were built in Ukraine in December alone. The target number for the year 2024 is 1 million drones. Even if that one is not realistic, 700,000 or 800,000 is very much in the cards. And some of these drones have the range enough even for reaching St. Petersburg. Other drones have lower range, but are of low detectability, so Russian air defense is hardly able to take them down. So my guess here is that these long-range strikes against Russian core territory will continue due to three main reasons. First, there is a psychological effect, particularly ahead of Russian elections. Second, Ukraine usually targets facilities of military importance or fuel production facilities. So this is affecting also the Russian military machinery directly. And third, in order to defend herself against these drones, Russia needs to reposition advanced air defense systems from the front line to the hinterland. So these long-range strikes also serve the purpose of dividing Russia's air defense resources. So yes, they will continue. On the question of the possible Trump victory, here I have kind of an interesting question mark, a bit of epistemological question, if you like. How exactly do we know what to expect from Mr. Trump? What do we base our assessments on? Based on what he said? Dear colleagues, he has said so many things and the opposite of so many things that I think this is a primary source that needs to be taken definitely with a pinch of salt. So what we could build some assessment upon is first to analyze the thinking of the Trump team, and second, the actions taken during the first Trump administration. And when it comes to the first Trump administration, it was actually the first Trump administration which started to supply Ukraine with offensive weapons. The first Trump administration was much tougher on Russia when it comes to sanctions than the previous Obama administration. And regarding the future Trump team, and yes, we are not yet there, sure, but regarding the people who are already known to be around Trump, most of them are hardcore, hawkish Republicans. So it's not really realistic to expect that these people, this Trump team, would just cut over the support for Ukraine. And one more factor here. Most of the US military assistance manifests itself in contracts given to US defense industrial facilities. And most of the US defense industrial facilities which are producing the weapon systems for Ukraine are located in the Republican states, in red states. So my assumption here is that even if Trump is allowed to run, so there's no court sentence against him, if he becomes the Republican candidate, okay, this one is fairly sure, and even if he wins the elections, these are already three ifs, I don't think it's realistic to expect that Trump would immediately cut all the support. What may happen, and the people around Trump seem to make such indications, that the US would decrease the financial support, meaning Europe would have to pay more. But this is already the case. I mean, I already mentioned the Ukraine Support Tracker project. Those numbers are fairly indicative. So I do not think that we should perceive a future Trump administration as kind of an immediate Armageddon when it comes to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Much closer, much more detailed assessment is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will actually do that in one of our future sessions of this morning briefing series, looking at the US elections and its potential outcome and its meaning for not just the conflict in Ukraine, but also German and European foreign and security policy more broadly. So we'll come back to these difficult questions. But now, Klaus Wittmann, please.
Jan, may I just jump in quickly on the perception, because what Philip said, I think it's very important. Sure. We are not, and by that I mean the collective West is not projecting confidence. We are always on the back foot. We are allowing Russia to drive the narratives, they escalate, to maintain escalatory dominance, and this is a big problem. And if you see the Western public's impression about themselves, we lack it. And if we see the global South, they believe Russia will win. They believe, so we cannot actually be successful with commanding and deploying resources with this kind of attitude. And each country has a different story, whether it's domestic politics, whether it's fear of Russia, whether it's, people like Orban, who is preventing actually Europe to mobilize resources. And this is something what I would like to say on the back foot of Trump is we may hope, but we must understand that the times of the world are now changed so much that defense and security and national security must be at the forefront of domestic politics. Even if Trump gives all the necessary tools to Ukraine, it will not be enough just with US backing to defeat Russia and to establish peaceful coexistence among nations in Europe.
Sorry, yes, good point. I was going to give you a chance to respond after the next question. Now let's move on, Mr. Wittmann.
Klaus Wittmann, former general, and I teach contemporary history at Potsdam University. First of all, I think what Orysia just said is the description of a self-fulfilling prophecy that seems to be in progress in the West. Ukraine will not win, so we do less, and this is a vicious circle. But I wanted to thank András for the realistic assessment of the situation and of the effect of the Western handbrakes on. I fully agree, but I note that in describing Ukraine's needs, he has probably already given up on the long-range cruise missile Taurus, which was mentioned and which Ukraine, as well as most German politicians, demand as an ideal means for severely impairing Russian command and control and logistics behind the front and on Crimea. All typically German arguments against the delivery are false, but the real motives of Chancellor Scholz are easy to guess: fear of Putin's threats, and as Orysia said, he is not committed to a Ukrainian victory, i.e. liberation. Now the latest genius idea seems to be another Ringtausch, Taurus to the UK, and more of the less capable Storm Shadow from UK to Ukraine. This faint-heartedness is in marked contrast to what the Chancellor rightly said in the Bundestag in December about how European security depends on us in Ukraine. And my question is, what do you both think about the German maneuvering with regard to the Taurus? And one question on Trump. I heard that President Zelensky has invited him to Ukraine. Is that true? And is that not a very smart move?
Thank you very much for these questions. Allow me to collect one more question from my colleague, Benjamin Tellers.
Many thanks, Jan, and good morning, everyone. And thanks to András for such a clear outline of the military situation, but also to Orysia for putting this on the political level so clearly, and outlining what the current approach of the German Chancellery is, not for Ukraine to lose, but also not to win. And it's this lack of commitment to win that I think has been picked up by several of the commenters now, which projects not only a lack of confidence, but a lack of resolve. And this is a very dangerous signal that we're sending to Putin, not only about the conflict in Ukraine itself, but also about our potential ability to defend ourselves in future and will to defend ourselves. András, you mentioned very clearly and outlined the value that additional munitions would have, and General Wittmann just outlined this as well in relation to Taurus. But we're not actually equipping ourselves to provide Ukraine with what it needs. We're not actually upping up production. There's not been the political signals delivered to industry. We see that MBDA, the main missile manufacturer, has a contract for a production line for Greece at the moment, but nothing for Ukraine and nothing to replenish our stocks, actually. What, in your view, is behind this reluctance to actually step up? Is it that we're still just asleep at the wheel? We're still not awake to the threats that Russia actually poses to a wider Europe, including in light of the uncertainty that would be around the US security guarantee should Trump actually come in? Or what is driving this reluctance to actually step up to the challenge that we face? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And so let's collect these three questions: reluctance on ammunition, German maneuvering, and Trump. And I'd like to give each of you a chance for closing remarks. Since we only have two speakers today, we'll wrap up a little earlier, but enough time for both of you to respond to these questions or anything else that you need to say as closing remarks. So first, Orysia, and then András in reverse order.
Thank you. I think at the core of the problem is that in Ukraine, people are not afraid of Russia anymore because they have no alternative. But in the West, there is still quite a lot of fear that incapacitates strategic thinking. And I think one way to overcome it, and perhaps not immediately, but to look at the facts on the ground, what has been happening since the start of this war. Russia is defeatable. Russian troops have been pushed out of Ukrainian territory, 50% of what they occupied since the start of this full-scale invasion. Russia now is threatened in Crimea, something that many in Germany thought was unthinkable. Russians had lost more than, I think, 20 naval ships of different caliber, including flagship Moscow, right? Russia lost control of the Snake Island. Russian fleet has to be pushed to Novorossiysk base to be away from the reach of Ukrainian missiles and drones. All of this is happening, and at the moment, yes, András showed the maps where Russians are taking steadily, 1 kilometer or another kilometer, but they are losing 400 men per 1 square kilometer. Think about those losses. This is unsustainable for Russia. Yes, they may take Avdiivka to put it on a silver platter for Putin, to Putin's coronation, but I think Russia has no strategy conventionally to win this war and achieve what they want, now plan minimum, all these territories that they annexed in the Russian constitution. That's a hell of a lot of a territory. So I think we have to understand that if Ukraine is given what it needs, and I think if we understand that if we don't want our soldiers, the German, the British, the Polish, to be fighting the Russian army, this is the best investment of the resources. As I said, this is a foolish belief that if the war somehow, freezes or stops, we will be able to divest from defense and security. No, quite the opposite, because Russians will be preparing for more and even bigger war. And just think about the military procurement now that Poland is doing, and think about what Ukraine is having on the battlefield. So Poland commissioned around 400 HIMARS systems. Ukraine has about 20, and we are expecting Ukraine to achieve miracle on Dnipro with very little kit. So I think we should get seriously, take European defense seriously, and honestly, we should be begging Ukrainians to fight. Because if Ukraine collapses, this slogan where Russia has no borders will arrive at our doorstep, maybe not tomorrow and maybe not in 1 year, but eventually this is the nature of Putin's regime that we are after. And I personally, unlike, I'm perhaps in the minority of Ukrainians who believe Russia can have a different future if it is defeated in Ukraine and if it is put back in the containment policy to actually start being preoccupied with its own federation rather than with causing trouble from Abkhazia to Syria. So, I mean, I really urge you to take this seriously, because in the end, we'll all pay more and we'll have more war in Europe.
Thank you very much, Orysia. And of course, one of the things that will determine how things develop is also the European response. And allow me to slip in a little advertisement here for one of our events coming up on how the EU should manage the Orban challenge in 2024, which will have an impact on accession talks and support, of course, which will an event that we'll host here at DGAP on the 1st of February. And you'll find the details on our website, or my colleagues will post them in the chat. But now let me hand over to András for answering the final round of questions and some closing remarks.
Thank you, Jan. First and foremost, I'd like to support what Orysia said. Yes, the Russian army can be defeated. To tell you kind of an insider story, with some DGAP colleagues, we made a trip to Kiev in the autumn, and we had the opportunity to have an interview also with the EU advisory mission there on the military situation and other things. And we heard from those officials, no need for names here, Ukraine is publishing the losses inflicted to the Russian army every day. And those numbers are actually fairly accurate. And I just leave some time to digest this. This means that Russia has lost already more than 350,000 soldiers killed, wounded, captured combined. This is 1.5 times larger than the entire invasion contingent. This Russian army is not invincible and it's not infinite. It can be defeated and gets defeated. Every day, literally every day, Russian forces have been losing an entire battalion at Avdiivka. This is such a level of bloodshed which cannot be sustained for too long. The only thing we need to do is to keep Ukraine in the fight. So it's not an impossible task. So Russia is not kind of a 10 feet tall, undefeatable nemesis. They want us to believe so, but they aren't. Regarding the questions, to General Wittmann, even though I've been working at DGAP since 2019, I still consider myself a foreigner. And because of that, I try not to comment on German security policy, because first, I'm not researching it. Second, it would feel odd if a foreigner would comment how Germany should do. I mean, I just wouldn't feel myself confident with the situation. So this question I would like to rather pass. When it comes to inviting Trump to Kiev, a nice communication move, but of course, Trump will not accept the invitation. He probably even couldn't do so, also for security reasons. So yes, a nice move, but no other effect. When it comes to the question of my colleague Ben Tallis about European defense industry not up for the challenge, the good news here is that a more differentiated look provides a slightly brighter picture. Some European countries have already been upscaling their defense industry productions. Of course, smaller countries, sure. But Poland, Sweden, Finland, the Baltic states, as Romania, Bulgaria is the only country which is still able to produce Soviet-style ammunition for 122 millimeters, 125 tank shells, all these things. Yes, the big ones are still lagging behind. However, there is a very interesting paper recently published by the Institute for the Study of War, the support needed for recreating Ukraine's own defense industry. It was published, I think, on the 12th of January or something like this, some 2 weeks ago. It's a very, very informative piece about all the projects that are already going on. It just takes time for them to materialize. To give you an example, Rheinmetall is going to set up factory and repair plant on Ukrainian soil. That's quite a big thing. Some other German companies are thinking about the same. When I said that repair facilities need to be deployed closer to the Ukrainian border, this is already happening both in Poland and in Romania. So I'm a bit more optimistic here when it comes to the medium term. Based on the numbers I know, and because this is an open event, I'm not going to disclose those numbers. The second half of this year will be already a lot better when it comes to ammunition supplies. However, the first half of the year will be still very bitter for Ukraine, simply because it takes time for all ammunition supplies, for the increase of supplies to materialize. And about the results, whether we are still sleepwalking, this I honestly don't know. Because in order to assess why, let's say, France or Spain or Italy is having the policies that they have when it comes to support for Ukraine, you need experts of those countries. I'm not one of them. But when it comes to Italy, the Italian Senate just approved the assistance for Ukraine for this year. Yes, yesterday's news. So now it goes to the other house, but still some things are moving. So in the second half of the year, the situation will be hopefully a bit better, but in the short run, it's going to be quite despairing.
Thanks very much. And thanks to both of you. This has been extremely informative. And of course, there are open questions left to be answered. I saw a couple of questions on Russian domestic politics, for instance, which we'll come back to in future iterations of this morning briefing. We will close for today, but of course, in the coming weeks, we are coming back to the conflict in the Middle East. And of course, we'll look across the Atlantic to the United States and keep an eye on the conflict, the Russian assault against Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining us, Orysia and András today, and to all of you in the audience for your interest. Take care and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.